Hi, everyone. I am here with Tara Jensen, author of Flower Power. Just to give you a little background about myself and the Retail Bakers of America, I'm Marissa Veely. I am the Certification Education Director with the RBA. The RBA is a nonprofit retail baking trade organization that creates industry-specific training programs, and we foster a community of retail bakers from across the country in a form of exchanging industry and business information. We have networking, learning opportunities, and mentoring among our bakers. And we are so excited to be doing this book club series with Tara. Hi, Tara. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Tara has worked as a professional baker. She was a bakery owner. She's been featured in Food and Wine and Bon Appetit. And this is her second book, Flower Power, The Practices and Pursuits of Baking Sourdough Bread, which was released in August 2022, so this past August. So Tara, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into this, how you got into writing, all of that.
Sure, I'd love to. I we were speaking earlier, and I like to joke that I've had sort of three separate chapters to my baking life. I started baking, of course, with my mom. I grew up in Maine, and we did a lot of sweets, and there was always a hot chocolate chip cookie after school, so no complaints there. I didn't really find the artisan bread world until I was in school. I was going to college at College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine, and there was a bakery there called the Morning Glory. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was just filled with the coolest people. So I got a job there and first kind of fell in love with bakers and then the bread. And I spent my 20s basically traveling around the country working at different bakeries, some large scale, some smaller. I worked at Red Hen Baking in Middlesex, Vermont, and I worked at Bread Farm in Bow Edison, Washington, and everywhere kind of in between. And then when I turned into my early 30s, I was in Western North Carolina, and I was sort of introduced to the more artisanal craft, wood fired, freshly milled flour, the connecting the farmer to the miller, to the baker, to the customer, and sort of plunged into a new chapter of baking there. And that is where I had my small farmers market based bakery called Smoke Signals. I used a 20-year-old Alan Scott wood fired oven to bake everything in and chopped all the wood by myself. It was a really beautiful experience. But while that was going on, I also wanted to start a family and figure out how to do more writing. I'd always wanted to be a writer ever since I was a kid, and was fortunate to write my first book while I was still baking at that bakery in Asheville, and that's called A Baker's Year. And it just goes through a year of what it's like to sort of live solitary at a wood-fired bakery. And I fell in love with the writing and then teaching. I opened up the bakery to workshops, and at first it started casually, and then they were really in high demand. There was quite a number of folks, I say, baking alone at home that really wanted to come into a bakery and see how to do it. So I switched gears, and for the past 6 or 7 years, I have been teaching people how to bake, writing about baking, primarily with freshly milled flour, sometimes whole grain. I do use sifted flour, and then, of course, various sourdough culture. So I keep a few different kinds. And I teach in person workshops. I have a mobile wood fired oven. So in person experiences generally are with a wood fired oven. And then I do a Zoom series of baking workshops as well.
That's great. That's a huge history in all different areas of baking. How did you specifically get into sourdough, and how did that become the topic of focus for this book?
I feel lucky in the sense that it was always there for me, even at some of the larger artisanal bakeries, like say Red Hen in Vermont. We would use yeasted foolish, but we always had some sort of vat of sourdough that you would feed at night, and so it was just always. In some ways, as a baker, that's how I found for myself what I'll call like the right places to show up at. Kind of following that thread through larger bakeries, and then, of course, coming to Western North Carolina and using all this beautiful, freshly milled flour, thyme as an ingredient So, of course, using a slower culture or natural leavening just paired really organically with the freshly mud flour and the wood fired oven. So I've been steeped in it. But to be honest, like as a baker, I'm also very curious about all forms of leavening and have started adding a little bit of yeast to things or creating a poolish and I'm like, is it gonna explode? So it's sort of I feel ridiculous sometimes. Oh my god. Um, of course, now I primarily bake from home and I'm a parent, and so the time is quite a luxury. But I also love the flavors from a yeasted ferment like a foolish. So I'm exploring now in my own baking as well other kinds of leavening beyond sourdough, but it has always been the way that I've sort of found the people and the bakeries that I want to be investigating.
Yeah, I love that you hit on this idea of sourcing from local mills. That's such, a hot topic right now and becoming more and more common for even larger retail operations to be sourcing from local mills. Can you speak a little bit to that and how you've developed those relationships with those mills and sources?
Yeah, I think I always advocate for going to your farmer's market and first and just checking out what's there. We have seen such an explosion in the past decade of um, these local folks like rebuilding regional grain economies. So it's not actually that unheard of, at least up and down the eastern seaboard, to be able to find some fresh milk flour at your farmer's market. So I always tell people to try that first, just in terms of meeting people and networking. It's a wonderful space for that. And then just start looking around in your area. I am really excited right now. I was like just on a road trip and stopped by Deep Roots Milling, which is in Roseland, and they are reviving an old water wheel mill, but doing beautiful sort of more modern flowers on it. So things are happening in all of these little pockets. And where I am now in the Mid Atlantic, there's also the Common Grain Alliance. So I think just sometimes you just have to meet the right people, and then this whole sort of culture will open up for you. So it doesn't pay to be shy. You kind of have to get out there and just start. I definitely have just knocked on the door before and been like, "Oh, I see you have grain growing here," which maybe isn't everyone's comfort level. But I find in general, most of the folks that I've met through trying to track down, we're about to plant a quarter acre in our backyard tomorrow, actually, of some various wheats and rye. People are very welcoming, even though we're seeing this gorgeous resurgence. It's still not everybody that is turning their lawn into a wheat field.
Right.
So people are generous with their knowledge and time for sure. I don't know if that directly answered your question, but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. I can't believe that's amazing that you're turning your whole backyard into a wheat field. That's next level. That's awesome.
I comfort myself. It's just grass seed, so it's
Mm,
like right,
yeah,
should be fine.
yeah, that's true. So I know it can be daunting to kind of delve into the world of sourdough. It's less predictable than using commercial yeast. What would you recommend to someone that's kind of wants to kind of get into sourdoughs, someone that's used to using commercial yeast? What would you recommend to that baker?
Yeah, I think just understanding that the time frame and the rhythm is going to be different, and just accepting that from the get go. And it's not like the amount of hands on time is going to greatly increase, but what might take you an afternoon or a day for the to sort of pull out the most vibrant flavor from like beautiful freshly milled flour, or even roller milled flour, but using a sourdough culture, right? We've got lactic acid bacteria in there, and that's the difference sort of between the two. If you've got just a packet of commercial yeast, you open it up, it's really the same kind of yeast that you might find in that packet and in your sourdough starter. But in your sourdough starter, you get the addition of lactic acid bacteria. And those lactic acid bacteria are going to create various kinds of acidities in your dough which gives it some strength and also gives it some flavor. And so we're using the sourdough for that culturing purpose. So we want to make sure that we give it enough time for those actions to happen inside the dough before we bake it. So generally, a day for the rising and the mixing and the strength building into your dough and the shaping. I like to shape proofed bread in the fridge or in a cooler or walk-in overnight and then bake it cold in the hot oven the next morning. That's my preferred method. But just understanding you might take what would happen in a day, you're not really changing the steps in the process. The way you shape it might be similar or any of those things, but you're just extending the timeline to pull out beautiful flavor from the flour.
Yeah, it's a great way to think about it. Yeah. Just curious, how many sourdoughs do you usually have going at once? Like how many sourdoughs do you have currently in your home?
I think three.
Three, okay.
This is my rye starter. I'm gonna make a 100% rye bread later, which I love this time of year. I know everyone's all about pumpkin, but this is like good time for rye baking. But in Flour Power and then just in my own life, I keep three. So I keep a classic white flour sourdough. So a large amount of water and like a roller milled white bread flour. Those two things together are really going to encourage a lot of lactic acid bacteria.
Mhm.
So you get that kind of tangy classic sourdough flavor from that starter. Then I keep a stiff whole grain starter called the Daism. And that one I think of more as my yeast ball, very technical, but the lower hydration, so it's about 50% hydration. It's a really stiff starter that you need almost like a baseball, and the addition of the whole grain. The starter takes a long time to ferment, but it's also not very sour or acidic. So sometimes when I'm baking with fresh and milk flour or whole grains, I like to use the Daism starter because you're actually tasting more the flavor of the flour than say the flavor that the lactic acid is creating in the dough when you use something like that more classic sourdough starter. And then I keep my rye. So this is 100% rye flour. It's a little stiff, so maybe 75, 80% hydration. And I don't want to play favorites, but if I had to go to a desert island, I think I would choose my rye. I tend to like the Daism because the rye has a lot more available minerals and sugars in the flour itself, in the endosperm of the rye berry. It ferments really well, like it catches easily. And I think that that's always reassuring when you're starting a new culture to see it come alive quickly. Day 3 and you're like, oh God,
Yeah.
you can feel like you've done something wrong. So rye will treat you to a nice rise early on, and it has a great staying power. So they all started life differently, and I feed them different kinds of flour and let them ferment at different temperatures. But in all truth, you could keep one culture and make many from that.
I think that's such a beautiful approach though, because there's such complexity to the different flavors depending on those different flours and the feedings, and then being able to kind of pick and choose which sourdough you want for what application, I think is a really kind of beautiful approach to flavor, right? Which is really interesting about your book because you have breads in there, but then you have other applications for the sourdough as well. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, in a commercial setting or in a bakery setting, I was always so confused about what sourdough discard was because it's I like to say bread making is something that if we're doing every day, it's a closed loop system. There really isn't a lot of waste. So you're feeding your starter, you're pulling some off, it's going into the bread, and that cycle is going to be beautifully repeating itself every day in a bakery. But at home, maybe you're baking once a month, and so folks will take out their starter, and then there's a lot of refreshing that needs to happen to both balance out the acidity and sort of wake everything back up to be ready to leaven your bread. And so folks will often have discards. So the whole back of the book is called Extra Credit, and it's just recipes for what to do with that amount of discard that comes off your starter as you're getting it back up to speed. And there's brownies, I think, is I do have a sweet tooth, thanks to my mom. But I do. There's rye brownies and pie crust, which I'm about to start making for Thanksgiving. There's a sourdough pie crust, which not only kind of gives it like a nice cultured flavor to the dough, but it extends really well, which is that little addition of the starter. So all sorts of things like that. Pancakes and waffles, of course, but then things like coffee cake and biscuits as well. So the back is really, I think, a hidden gem in the book.
Yeah, like the sourdough chocolate chip cookies, all of that. I think it's a great use of that discard, rather than having the waste, putting it to delicious use. Right. Um, so what other takeaways would you like? What else do you want people to get from your book when they're delving in and starting to look at your formulas and recipes?
Yeah, I mostly want people to be excited to bake and to just, we purposefully use the word process in the subtitle because I want people to understand that, baking can be a lifelong craft and to pull back a little bit from, obsessing over the perfect loaf for Instagram. And we all do it, we're all human, but, engaging with baking as a craft of your life and to just enjoy the whole process from getting your starter out and feeding it to mixing the dough to baking it and sharing it. And, in my opinion, that's sort of where the health benefit lies, is in the whole process and engaging with the process. And then, of course, like we were talking about earlier, the wonderful people like you that we get to meet on this journey. So I think, yeah, understanding the overall scaffolding of bread making and then allowing yourself to just get grounded and dip into it when you're actually making the bread. Yeah.
Thank you. It's such a beautiful book. It really is. Can you tell people where they can find you on your website, on Instagram, where they can buy the book? Um,
Absolutely.
mhm.
So I'm on Instagram. My handle is Baker Hands. And my website is Tara E. Jensen. And I teach in-person classes with a mobile wood-fired oven. So all of our pies and croissants and bread are all done baked in a wood-fired oven in my in-person experiences. And then I also teach online classes as well. So we're just getting through a whole summer and fall bread package and getting ready to release our winter workshop classes. But I do them cooking show style. So I just condense the whole process into an hour and a half, and it's generally a really good time. And as far as Flower Power goes, you can order it anywhere that books are sold, and you can also on my website there's a link to order it right through Penguin Random.
Great. Well, everyone should go check it out. It's a beautiful book. Thank you, Tara, again for being part of the RBA Book Club. And I hope that you have a great day.
So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Tara. Bye-bye.